Hold on. Skittermanders have a -1 circumstance penalty on perception checks to sense motive? That reminds me, I've got some chain emails I need to forward. Today, we're going to continue our conversation about the ancestries featured in the Starfinder 2e playtest on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is openly calling for Paizo to hurry up and give us a plushie of Prisma the Skittermander. This needs to happen ASAP. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to my series on the ancestries that are part of the Starfinder 2e playtest. Currently, Paizo is doing a public playtest for Starfinder 2nd Edition, where they are updating Starfinder to use a rule system compatible with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. One of the design goals of this project is to make the two games cross-compatible, where characters and options from one game could perceivably be used in the other game, while still having two games that function effectively as standalone products as well. It's a very lofty and ambitious goal, but I'm honestly excited to see Starfinder, which I consider to be one of the best written in terms of setting TTRPGs in the industry. I'm excited to see Starfinder brought forward to Pathfinder 2e's mechanics, which I consider to be some of the most solid and effective game engine mechanics in the industry. And as a side effect, it also gives me plenty of opportunity to talk about Skittermanders, which are objectively the best ancestry ever written for any RPG ever. End of discussion. As a genuine statement about Starfinder 1st Edition, one of the big selling points of that game was the diverse array of ancestry options, of different choices you could make to represent the different alien creatures that would be running around the Starfinder universe. And while the Starfinder 2e playtest cannot repeat the dozens of character options that currently exist in the first edition of Starfinder, Paizo has given us a very healthy first look at what ancestries can be in Starfinder 2nd Edition. There are 10 playable ancestries in the playtest and 2 playable versatile heritages. That is a pretty sizable offering, and in this video series, I'm going through the different offerings to see what Paizo is testing out for the different ancestries in this game. In the first video, we discussed androids, humans, Ysoki, and the Borai Versatile Heritage. And I will have a link to the first video in this series down in the video description if you want to go and check that out. But today, I decided to drift on over to the Veskarium and take a look at a few of the ancestries that originally hail from the planets inside of the Veskarium. So, effectively today, I plan to take a look at the Vesk, the Skittermanders, and the Pahtra, and then, for the 4th ancestry in this video, I was originally going to do a poll on my channel, but then I realized one of the things that I wanted to talk about in this video, I needed to include either the Lashunta or the Shirren, so ultimately I decided to go with Shirren since they came in 2nd place on my previous poll. So today we'll have the Vesk, the Skittermanders, the Pahtra, and the Shirren. We're going to take a look at them and the mechanics behind them, see what they offer players at the gaming table, and talk a little bit about the design or play space around these ancestries in Starfinder 2e. Now that does mean that at the end of this video, there will still be 4 options that I haven't covered yet as part of the series. So when I return with the last video in this series, I will be covering the Barathu, the Lashunta, the Kasathas, and then finally the Prismeni Versatile Heritage. All of those will be covered in the next video. And once that video goes live, I'll try to remember to have some links to that in the video description as well. Feel free to tag me in the comments section if I forget. But the goal with this series is to take a look at all of the Ancestry options that Paizo has put forward, and talk about the design of Ancestries as a play space in Starfinder 2e going forward. Of course, before we dive into all of that, don't forget to do all of the stuff that helps us support this channel. If you enjoy this content, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, since this is the second video in this series, I actually get to skip a little bit of the preamble that I did in the previous video in this series. If you want to hear a little bit about the ABCs of character creation and some of the discussion of character languages, that's in the first video in this series, but today we're just going to dive right in and start taking a look at the 4 ancestries that are at the core of this video, and I'm going to start with the last one alphabetically because this is, narratively, one of the most significant ancestries in the Starfinder setting, and that is the Vesk. The Vesk are described as a warmongering reptilian people who conquered the 8 worlds of their solar system shortly after developing spaceflight, forming what is known as the Veskarium Empire. The Veskarium Empire was, at one time, a major antagonist to the Pact Worlds, but when the threat of something known as the Swarm emerged, the Veskarium Empire and the Pact Worlds were forced to set aside their differences and work together in order to defeat the threat of the Swarm. But as should be obvious from the description we've mentioned so far, the threat of rising tensions is a real possibility going forward in the setting, meaning that Vesk and the Veskarium Empire occupy a little bit of a dangerous niche in the Starfinder setting, narratively speaking. We are told that the Vesk tend to embrace conflict and that they respect strength and military might, and taking a look at the traits of the Vesk, you can see that that is built straight into this ancestry. The Vesk come with 10 bonus hit points as an ancestry. They're medium sized. They have a speed of 20 feet, but when you drop down to their recommended attribute boosts and flaws, they come with a boost to Constitution, Strength, and a free boost with a flaw to Wisdom. That attribute boost suite speaks very clearly to the warrior culture that is very common with the Vesk. Now, since this is the first ancestry we are talking about in this video, I want to go ahead and remind you that the alternate attribute boost system from Pathfinder 2e also applies to Starfinder 2e, so you can replace the recommended attribute boosts and flaws of any ancestry with just 2 free boosts, no flaws, and use that instead. That is a variant option that is available to any ancestry inside of the game, including the Vesk, but you can see with the recommended attribute boosts and flaws here that the culture of the Vesk tends to lean very heavily towards military, towards strength, towards combat. This is an ancestry that is not afraid of a fight. In terms of languages, the Vesk begin with Common, Vesk, and 1 regional language of your choice, which for the Vesk PC is actually probably a description of which world the Veskarium conquered that they grew up on. Then you gain an additional number of languages equal to your intelligence modifier, and you have the traits of Humanoid and Vesk along with Low Light Vision. Again, as you can see right out of the box with the Vesk, they are going to occupy a space similar to dwarves and tougher ancestries like that in Pathfinder. They are very much geared towards combat, both surviving combat and making their presence known in combat, but they may struggle in situations that require a little more subtlety. Looking at the write-up for the Vesk, we see what we saw in the video last time, that Starfinder 2e is taking an approach to writing up ancestries similar to what we see with ancestries in Pathfinder 2e. You begin with a sidebar that highlights some things that might be true about your character, and then you also get some notes of things that other people probably suspect or believe about your character. You get a physical description of the ancestry and a discussion of their society. You get some sample names. Although I do want to point out, in the society section, it does note that some Vesk take on epithets that signify their victories in combat, And if you are interested in playing a Vesk, I actually think that that is a fun angle that you can lean into. Not just naming your character, but establishing some title that is associated with how your character first achieved some renown among their peers. Next, you get a section on Vesk beliefs, including popular edicts and anathema that might influence your character if you're playing a Vesk. But all of these different sections are the things we're used to seeing in Ancestry write-ups in Pathfinder. You're going to get the same thing in Starfinder 2e, and it's going to be true of each of the Ancestries we're looking at today. However, most people skip over these sections, and they like to jump to the Heritages section because this is the next part of the write-up where the mechanics of the Ancestry take center stage again. So, when it comes to Heritages for the Vesk, they come with 5 possible Heritages, though I'll go ahead and tell you, one of the Heritages is not going to make a lot of sense until we actually dig into the Ancestry feats, but still, let's talk about these really quick. The first heritage for the Vesk is called the Brisk Wonder Vesk, and it's pretty simple. Your speed increases by 5 feet. Anyone who has played Pathfinder 2e for a while knows that a speed bonus is very nice. That 20-foot move speed for the Vesk is definitely a notable hindrance, so moving up to the point where you're on par with the typical Ancestry movement speed of 25 feet is definitely an appealing option. The Night Stalker Vesk is adapted to live in darkness, possibly due to living underground or fighting in space a lot, and as a result they have dark vision. The next heritage is called the Plated Vesk, and this is a Vesk where your scales have hardened to the point that they are functionally armor. Your scales count as medium armor in the plate armor group. They grant a +4 item bonus to AC, they have a dex cap of +1, a check penalty of -2, and a strength threshold of +3. Additionally, your scales as armor have the comfort trait, and you can wear a flight suit, but you can't wear any other armor. Finally, it's worth noting that you can etch armor runes into your scales, but you can't install armor upgrades. And that's actually a little bit of an interesting niche for the Vesk. I don't know how hard Paizo is going to lean into this going forward, but if you've seen any of the videos from Prime Productions, you would know that one of the interesting differences in items in Pathfinder and Starfinder is Pathfinder leans into this rune system, whereas the technology of Starfinder focuses instead on upgrades. Here we have a Vesk heritage that actually avoids the Starfinder upgrades and prefers the Pathfinder runes, and I'm curious to see exactly how important that becomes in the Starfinder 2e setting or meta. I don't know, it just stands out to me, and I feel like it's going to mean something. I might be overthinking this. Next up we have the Venom Thought Vesk, and this is a little bit of a unique heritage for the Vesk, as you are one of the notable Vesk born with psychic talents. According to Vesk lore, certain Vesk modified themselves to have venomous thoughts, but mechanically what this means is that you gain access to the cantrip Daze, which you can cast as an occult innate cantrip at will. This Daze cantrip will auto-heighten, like most cantrips do in Pathfinder 2e and also in Starfinder. And in addition to your cantrip, you also gain a +1 circumstance bonus on occultism checks to recall knowledge about psychic traditions and philosophies. Mostly I feel like the Venom Thought Vesk has been included here as a way to offer a non-martial oriented heritage for people who want to play a Vesk with a slightly different feel or theme that can stay on brand with the Veskarium Empire and the image that that tends to evoke. Our final heritage is called the Warblood Vesk, and you come from a bloodline of renowned warriors who have honed their bodies over the centuries to become lethal weapons. You gain the Brutal Anatomy Ancestry feat twice. Now, at the moment, we don't have a lot of context for what that means, but to help establish that context, many Ancestries in Pathfinder and Starfinder both have the ability to gain natural weapons through heritages or ancestry feats, different things like that, and the Vesk Ancestry does have a first level ancestry feat known as Brutal Anatomy that gives them some different options for natural weapons. In fact, it gives them 3 different options for natural weapons that they can choose from. So, any Vesk who wants to have natural weapons, they can take Brutal Anatomy and pick one of these 3 options. But the Warblood Vesk, specifically what it's doing, is it's coming in and giving you Brutal Anatomy for free twice before you pick your actual first level Ancestry feat, meaning that if you want to, you can play a first level Vesk who takes Brutal Anatomy all 3 times, and as a result begins play with all 3 natural weapons available. Is that the best build for a Vesk character? Maybe, maybe not. But this heritage is very much geared towards people who want their entire body to be a living weapon, which is very on brand for Vesk characters. Alright, so now that we've looked at heritages, let's go ahead and talk about the first level Vesk Ancestry feats. If you haven't seen the first video in the series, we're not looking at all of the feats that Ancestries have access to. I will show a few pages and you can pause the video and read through really quick if you want, but we're just taking a look at the first level Ancestry feat options because I think that gives you a good idea of the flavor and kind of thematic emphasis that Paizo's going for with each of the Ancestries. And in case you're not sure what the Ancestry theme for the Vesk is, please note that Bathed in Blood is one of the first level options here. That should probably spell it out for you. However, our first Vesk Ancestry feat option is Armor Ace, and what this does is it gives armor that you wear the Bulwark trait. Now, the Bulwark trait is a trait that allows you to gain a bonus against area of effect damage in place of your normal dexterity modifier, and the Bulwark trait typically sits on armor that would be worn by someone who doesn't have a lot of dexterity. The idea is, you may not be particularly agile yourself, but your armor effectively covers you well enough that you are still able to avoid a lot of the danger that comes from area of effect attacks. In effect, the Bulwark trait helps characters that tend to wear heavy armor avoid some of the penalties of AoE attacks. In the case of this particular feat, any armor that you wear gains this Bulwark trait. So even armor that normally doesn't have the Bulwark trait, you give it the Bulwark trait because as a Vesk, you're just used to adapting armor to the battlefield conditions and using it to protect yourself, and instead of the normal +3 bonus to reflex saves that the Bulwark trait would give you, your character gains a +4 bonus to reflex saves instead. Up next, we have the Ancestry feat that I mentioned a moment ago, Bathed in Blood, and I have to say that knowing how dangerous persistent bleed damage is in Pathfinder, I am excited to see this show up as an option for the Vesk. You gain a +1 status bonus to any persistent bleed damage that you deal, and you can spend a 1-action activity during your turn to roll a DC 10 flat check to remove persistent bleed damage that you are suffering. That DC 10 flat check is much better than the normal DC 15, so this feat means you are better at inflicting persistent bleed damage and better at avoiding the consequences of the same. Let's just say I like this feat, I think it's a lot of fun. Brutal Anatomy is the next Vesk Ancestry feat, and remember, if you take the Warblood Heritage, you get to take this feat for free twice before picking your normal first level Ancestry feat. Brutal Anatomy, when you take it, you gain one of the following unarmed attacks of your choice: Jaws, Claw, or Tail. Each of these unarmed attacks deal 1d6 damage, but each of them has a different damage type and different traits. A Claw is 1d6 slashing, with the Agile and Finesse traits. Jaws are 1d6 piercing with the Grapple trait, and a Tail attack is 1d6 bludgeoning with the Sweep and Trip traits. When you take this feat, pick one of these options, and you have access to that attack. Additionally, at 5th level, whenever you get a critical hit with one of these attacks, you gain the critical specialization effect of that weapon as well. Our next Vesk Ancestry feat option is called Fearless. This one's pretty simple. If you roll a success on a saving throw against fear, you get a critical success instead. Straightforward, very easy to understand. The next option is called Menacing Snarl. This is a free action usable once per hour, and it triggers whenever you frighten a creature. The feat notes that you snarl, hiss, shout, or otherwise verbally menace the triggering creature as you frighten them. What this does is increase the value of the frightened condition by 1. Frightened is one of the most ubiquitous and useful debuffs in Pathfinder and Starfinder. There are a lot of opportunities to inflict the frightened condition, and menacing snarl is, once per hour, just make that condition worse when you use it. The final first level Vesk Ancestry feat is called Vesk Weapon Familiarity. And Weapon Familiarity is a feat that we generally see attached to every ancestry in one fashion or another. Here we get to see it for the Vesk. Cyprime Productions has talked about Weapon Familiarity in several videos on his channel. So if you'd like a deeper discussion of Weapon Familiarity, what it is, what it means, check out a few of his videos, and you'll probably catch a pretty good conversation on this topic very quickly. The feat reads, you are trained with all Doshkos. In addition, you gain access to all uncommon weapons with the Vesk trait. For the purposes of proficiency, you treat any of these that are martial weapons as simple weapons, and any that are advanced weapons as martial weapons. At 5th level, whenever you get a critical hit with one of these weapons, you get its critical specialization effect. Now, it's very important to note that at 5th level ability, that applies to the Vesk trait weapons that were discussed in that paragraph, and to the Doshkos that were mentioned in that very first sentence. The critical hit, critical specialization effect applies to all of the weapons covered by the Vesk Weapon Familiarity feat. So taking a look at our first ancestry today, the Vesk, we have Armor Ace, Bathed in Blood, Brutal Anatomy, Fearless, Menacing Snarl, Weapon Familiarity. You can tell that the Vesk are intended to be a very combat-oriented ancestry, and a lot of the narrative themes around the Vesk are going to highlight that. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the other Vesk Ancestry feats. You can see some of the 5th level feats on screen right now. Feel free to pause the video and read through them real quick if you want. And here's a brief glimpse at some of the higher level feats as well. Again, pause and read through if you want to. But all of this should give you a pretty clear picture of the Vesk as a very combat-oriented ancestry. As we've mentioned, the Vesk have conquered a number of planets in their star system, so let's go ahead and skip over to one of the ancestries that the Vesk have conquered, and that is the Skittermanders. If you're a fan of this channel, you know that I absolutely love Skittermanders. I consider them to be the greatest ancestry ever, and I will not be taking any further questions on this topic. Seriously, I love Skittermanders, they're amazing, and I can't wait to play a Skittermander Witch Warper in Starfinder 2e. I absolutely want one. Skittermanders are described as excitable 6-armed humanoids with brightly colored fur. Driven by an insatiable desire to help those around them, they perform countless acts of kindness with a chaotic enthusiasm that borders on manic. I love Skittermanders, and I will hype them till the day I die. The actual lore of Skittermanders is they come from the world that is now known as Vesk 3, and when the Vesk arrived on their planet, the Vesk arrived and said, we're here to conquer you, and the Skittermanders, functionally as a society, just said, cool, we'll help! Go this way, there's our command center! The Vesk, horribly confused by this, and driven by a warrior culture and deep sense of honor, weren't allowed to kill the helpful Skittermanders, and found themselves conquering a group of people who were happy to help them do so. From there, Skittermanders rapidly spread around the Veskarium, enthusiastically helping anywhere and everywhere they saw fit, and then wandering off to whatever adventures caught their interest next. I suspect that to this day, conquering the Skittermanders remains the #1 regret of Vesk society as a whole throughout the course of their entire history. By the way, I also consider it mandatory that if you are playing a Skittermander in a Starfinder 2e game, and someone happens to be playing a Vesk, that you must immediately and enthusiastically declare them to be friend and do everything in your power to help them, and watch them cringe as a result. Still, as overly enthusiastic as I may be about Skittermanders, let's go ahead and talk about their actual mechanics inside the game, Skittermanders are a small ancestry with a bonus of 6 hit points from their ancestry. They have a base speed of 25 feet, and they come with the recommended attribute boost of Dexterity, Charisma, and a free boost, along with an attribute flaw to Wisdom. When it comes to languages, Skittermanders begin play with Common, Vesk, and one regional language of their choice, and additional languages equal to their intelligence modifier, and they have the traits Humanoid and Skittermander. They have low light vision, and then they have 2 additional traits. One is Overeager Enthusiasm, and the other is 6-armed. Let's talk about Overeager Enthusiasm first. You are often oblivious in your enthusiasm to help others. You take a -1 circumstance penalty on perception rolls to sense motive, and a -1 circumstance penalty to will saves against emotion effects, with the exception of the Calm spell. If you've seen part 1 of this video, you may be aware that one of the things that I really like about the androids in Starfinder 2nd Edition is they came with a penalty called, I believe it was Emotionally Unaware. And I really appreciated the fact that Paizo was willing to put forward for the androids this very clear struggle for the ancestry. I think that small penalties like this actually help to add depth to options inside of a game and make options more compelling. So imagine my enthusiasm to discover that with the Skittermanders, Paizo has again, for the Starfinder 2e playtest, given them a very clear mechanical penalty. They have a penalty on perception checks to sense motive, and they have a penalty on will saves against emotion effects. These are things that Skittermanders naturally struggle with, and I actually appreciate that in design space. I'm not sure if specific ancestry-related flaws is going to be a thing in the final version of Starfinder 2e, but I hope that they are, and even if they're not an automatic feature like we see here, I certainly hope that things like this are at least an optional feature for some ancestries, because like I said, mechanics like this make options feel more engaging and interesting to me, so I actually appreciate this kind of design. The final trait that we should note about Skittermanders is the 6-armed trait. You have 6 arms, which allows you to wield and hold up to 6 hands worth of weapons and equipment. At any time, 1 pair of hands is designated as your active hands. You can change this designation from 1 pair of hands to another by taking the Switch Hands action. You can only perform actions with your active hands, and they have more information on playing characters with more than 2 hands on page 172 of the Starfinder 2e playtest. Now, we didn't see any multi-armed ancestries in the previous video in the series, but I'll go ahead and tell you there's going to be at least 1 more multi-armed ancestry in the next video, and this is another thing we see in Starfinder ancestry design that I do enjoy. Paizo is willing to give us very alien and interesting creatures, and one of the simple ways that you can diversify is with unusual anatomy like multi-armed creatures. Multi-armed creatures and multi-armed ancestries are the kind of thing that feel like a natural fit for a sci-fi or space opera setting. So I really appreciate that Paizo just kind of tackles this head on and makes it a very clear option inside of the game. But at the same time, Paizo is still deliberate enough to approach how they construct the rules so that unusual ancestry features, like having multiple arms, aren't unbalanced in play. Again, we have a write-up about Skittermanders, things that might be true about them, things that others probably believe about them, description, society. You get a discussion of Skittermander names. I do like the description that Skittermander names often start very short, like a single syllable, and then over the course of their life, just kind of whenever they feel like it, they add more and more syllables, and it gets progressively more and more ridiculous as time goes on. If you're playing a Skittermander, I strongly recommend doing this. Just add to your name every couple of sessions and see how long it takes the other players to figure out what you're doing to them. And yes, it does note that syllables can be repetitive, and as a Skittermander, you're certainly welcome to forget a few syllables here and there. It's not a big deal. You also have a discussion of Skittermander beliefs, their edicts, their anathema, that sort of thing. But again, let's jump down to the Skittermander Heritages, which is where the mechanics of the Ancestry come back into focus. I will say that I'm a little sad. Skittermanders only have 4 heritages that are offered. They are the Everwhelp, the Gadravich, the Scrabbler, and the Skitterraised. First up, you have the Everwhelp Skittermander. Despite being a full-grown adult, you've retained your stomach mouth either through a quirk of evolution, purposeful genetic manipulation, or biotech augmentation. Yes, stomach mouth. Feel free to read up on that one. It is both terrifying and adorable at the same time. This is a Jaws unarmed attack that deals 1d6 piercing damage. It's in the Brawling group and has the Finesse trait. Next up is the Gadravich Skittermander. You grew up in the subterranean realms of Gadravich, or in a similar dangerous underground environment, and you gain dark vision. The next option is the Scrabbler Skittermander. You've never mastered coordinating all 6 of your arms for manual manipulation. Instead, you use the lowest 2 as extra limbs for mobility. You have 4 arms rather than 6, and 4 legs rather than 2, but you gain a climb speed equal to your base land speed. Then, our final option is the Skitterraised. You've spent most of your life in a tight-knit community where teamwork is expected and crowds are just a giant group hug. You gain the Group Impression skill feat, and you gain a +2 circumstance bonus on checks to aid an ally at any skill check that doesn't have the attack trait. Listen, my enthusiasm for Skittermanders may be a little overwhelming, but can you say no to a heritage that gives you an excuse to call for giant group hugs at literally any moment? Moving on, let's take a look at the first level Skittermander feat options and see what kind of feats we can get from this ancestry. Up first, we have the Clinging Bite Ancestry feat, which requires the Everwhelp Skittermander Heritage. This feat gives your Jaws unarmed attack the Grapple trait, and you have the Grab ability, but you can only use the Grab ability following a successful critical hit rather than a normal hit. You can also use the Grab ability anytime you have a creature grabbed or restrained. Our next feat is called Dauntless. Skittermanders rarely feel fear, and they're really not going to go out of their way to try to experience it. You gain a +1 circumstance bonus on saves against fear, and on your will DC against attempts to demoralize you, and if you ever get a success on a save against a fear effect, you get a critical success instead. You will notice that the Dauntless feat does partially cancel out the earlier flaw we noted on the Skittermander Ancestry, but it doesn't completely do away with it, and while this is a small note, yes, I do think that is a good design decision. Next up, we have the Skittermander feat Fixation. You are fascinated with a particular specific topic, such as religious rites of a small sect of worshippers, the process of spaghettification, or the song sung by Asteres. You gain the additional lore feat and the assurance feat for the chosen lore. Listen, we're all nerds here. We all know what the fixation feat looks like, and I'm willing to bet that at least 1/3 of the people watching this channel probably have this feat in real life. Still, my favorite Skittermander Ancestry feat, from a purely flavor perspective, has to be Hugmaster. Born from the belief that a good, solid hug can make everything better, you've adapted your hugging talents to the battlefield. You gain the Titan Wrestler skill feat. Additionally, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to athletic checks to grapple, and you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to your fortitude DC to avoid being grappled. You give the best hugs. How can you not take this feat? I'm sorry, the other feats are good, but this is S tier Skittermander. I love this feat, and I will take it every time I build a Skittermander. Okay, that's probably not true, but still, I do love it. Moving on to another Skittermander feat that almost competes with Hugmaster in how much I love the thematic flavor here, we have the simple Ancestry feat, Hyper. You are hyperactive and full of energy. Your speed increases by 5 feet. A bonus to speed is always welcome in these games, and for the Skittermander, feels perfectly on brand. Our last Skittermander feat option is one of the Ancestry lore feats. This is something we've seen a lot in Pathfinder, and and we saw it for a few of these Starfinder Ancestries in the previous video. But there is a little bit of a twist to this one. Skittermander lore states that you are gregarious and friendly, but also passionately interested in the history of your people. You become trained in diplomacy and society, and you also gain the additional lore general feat for Skittermander lore. Finally, you also learn Morindamandrinen. Hey, I think I actually got that right on the first take, which is the original Skittermander language that has long been suppressed by the Veskarium. So from these feats, you can tell that Skittermanders are enthusiastic, they're friendly, they give the best hugs, and all of those themes really support Skittermander character concepts really well. That's the kind of stuff you're going to see if you try to play a Skittermander. Here's a quick glance at some of the higher level feats if you want to pause the video and read through them really quick. But if you can't tell, I absolutely love the Skittermanders, and I consider them to be a necessity in any Starfinder game. I will hype Skittermanders till the day I die. If you want a slightly less weirdly enthusiastic version of an ancestry that's had to deal with the Veskarium, the next option is the Pahtra. Pahtras are a humanoid feline species from a nearby star system. They're highly competitive and are known for achievements in magic, music, and war. Their homeworld was recently freed from occupation by the Veskarium, and they have joined the Pact Worlds. So the Pahtra is a more typical example of an ancestry that came into conflict with the Veskarium and was originally conquered by the Veskarium, but in Starfinder lore, Pahtra freedom fighters have recently thrown off the last few Veskarium occupiers, and now their home world is free and has joined the Pact Worlds, gaining a measure of protection by their alliance with the Pact Worlds, which I'm sure doesn't increase tensions with the Veskarium at all. Now, I will tell you that when it comes to the Pahtra, the Starfinder 2e art that I've seen for the Pahtra so far hasn't appealed to me. I like the Starfinder 1e art for the Pahtra a little bit more. I'm hoping as we get more examples of Starfinder 2e art for the Pahtra, we'll see some art in line with what we saw for them in Starfinder 1st Edition. But the idea of freedom-fighting felines that have thrown off the Veskarium and are masters of magic and music is still a very compelling ancestry, and I certainly think there's a lot of fun themes you can lead into. Mechanically, the Pahtra are a medium-sized ancestry that offer 8 bonus ancestry hit points and have a base speed of 25 feet. Their recommended attribute boosts are Dexterity and Charisma, with a free attribute boost, and then their recommended attribute flaw is Constitution. As for languages, they begin play with Common, Pahtra, and Vesk, and they have additional languages equal to their intelligence modifier, and their starting traits are Humanoid and Pahtra. In terms of other traits, they begin play with Dark Vision. Down here we see our write-up for the Pahtra. You have things that might be true about you, things that other people probably believe about you, a physical description of Pahtras, a discussion of Pahtra society, and a sample of traditional Pahtra names. Something that I think is very interesting about Pahtra naming conventions is that most Pahtras receive at least a portion of their name from a mystic inside of their community, and there's a lot of debate in Pahtra society about how to interpret that portion of their name. Is that part of their name something that is emblematic of something that this Pahtra is going to do? Or instead, should that portion of their name be seen as a sort of guiding principle that they should aspire to? And there's a little bit of cultural nuance in exactly how these mystic influenced names should be understood. You also get a discussion of Pahtra beliefs, some common edicts, and anathema. But moving down to Pahtra Heritages, you'll see that the Pahtra come with a healthy 6 heritage options in the Starfinder 2e playtest. Up first, we have the Hunter-Stalker Heritage. You descend from a long line of hunters, and your fur is especially well suited to blending into multiple environments. As long as you are in a natural and undeveloped environment, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to stealth checks to hide and sneak, to survival checks to subsist, and to your survival DC to cover tracks. I'm not exactly sure how your fur is supposed to help you cover tracks, but I'm guessing the long line of hunters is probably where that's supposed to come from. Next, we have the Krevash Pahtra. You or your ancestors chose to endure experimental bioengineering as a way of helping to fight the Veskarium. Choose a first level biotech augmentation. The selected augmentation is permanently part of your body and does not count against the number of augmentations you can implant. You don't pay the cost for this augmentation, and you can swap out this augmentation with another augmentation by paying the appropriate cost for whatever upgrade you're trying to get. Next up, we have the Mael's Chosen Pahtra, which is a fun take on cat's luck that you often see with feline ancestries in RPGs. Mael is the ancestral goddess of the Pahtra, and the Mael's Chosen Pahtra is a Pahtra that has a blessing or connection to their ancestral goddess in some fashion. And in fact, they encourage you when you take this feat to have some moment in your life that you can point to where Mael rescued your character from certain death. Mechanically, what this heritage does is the first time each day that you critically fail a saving throw, you immediately re-roll the saving throw as a free action, and this counts as a fortune effect. Listen, as someone who gladly burns hero points to avoid critically failing saves, I like this heritage. I think it's a good option. The next heritage option presented is the Pouncer Pahtra. You excelled in the war games of your youth, and you've trained hard to maintain your athletic ability. Your speed increases by 5 feet, and in addition to that, you don't automatically fail checks to high jump or long jump if you don't stride at least 10 feet first. I do like this heritage. I will note that this references a section of the rules I feel like people often forget about in Pathfinder 2e, that high jumps and long jumps are typically 2-action activities, because as part of those 2 actions, you have to move at least 10 feet first and then attempt your jump check. I feel like a lot of storytellers and players forget about those rules, but if you're at a table where those rules are remembered, the Pouncer Pahtra will obviously have an advantage. The Sandrover Pahtra is going to be our first example in this video of the Environmental Adaptation Heritage. We see a lot of heritages like this in Pathfinder 2e, and there are a few of them in Starfinder 2e as well, where you essentially have a heritage that adapts a particular ancestry to a specific biome, if you will, and in the case of the Sandromer Pahtra, this is going to be the heritage that gives you advantages at resisting heat and like blasted desert terrain. Now, if you choose the Sandromer Pahtra, you are small size instead of medium, and you ignore difficult terrain and uneven ground that is caused by sand. Additionally, environmental heat effects are 1 step less severe for you, and you can go 10 times as long before being affected by starvation or thirst. That is 4 different effects from a single heritage. None of them are particularly overwhelming, but I think the whole package of the Sandromer Pahtra is pretty nice here. The Rimewalker Pahtra is functionally the exact opposite. You have a thicker fur coat and you are more resistant to cold temperatures. Mechanically, what it gives you is cold resistance equal to half your level, and you treat environmental cold effects as if they were 1 step less extreme. It's not as many effects as the Sandromer, but that cold resistance can be pretty powerful, especially at later levels, so don't overlook that benefit. Next up, let's talk about the ancestry feats for the Pahtra. Our first option is a reaction called Competitive Spirit. Once per hour as a reaction, when an ally attempts a skill check with a skill that you have trained or better proficiency in, you can push yourself to be the best by competing with the triggering ally. Until the end of your next turn, you can attempt the same skill check to perform the same action or activity that your ally performed. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus on the check, and if you achieve at least 1 degree of success higher than your ally did, this use of Competitive Spirit doesn't count towards how often you can use this ability. Functionally, as long as you and your ally are doing the same thing, you can just give yourself +2 to the roll, and in a lot of team-based tactics, that's going to come up quite a lot. However, there is a downside. If you roll a critical failure on this skill check, you take a -1 circumstance penalty to all skill checks attempted with that skill for the next hour, as well, basically you've kind of embarrassed yourself. Next up, we have the feat Harmonic Sensitivity. You've developed keen sensory organs that have an amazing sensitivity to sound, and you know how to put them to use. You become trained in performance, or gain the Assurance skill feat with performance if you are already trained. In addition, you can accurately recall a melody or lyrics that you've heard within the last week, granting you a +2 circumstance bonus on deception and perform checks that involve mimicking speech or a specific sound. I have some friends in real life who are very gifted in terms of music, and I feel like I've seen this kind of ability used in real life a few times, so I think it could be a very fun role-playing mechanic. The next first level ancestry feat is called Long Whiskered. Your whiskers function as advanced electroreceptors, allowing you to orient yourself more easily. At the end of each round in which you are untethered, attempt a DC 15 flat check. On a success, you ignore the clumsy and off-guard conditions imposed by being in 0G for 1 minute. I mentioned this in the previous video, that in the one Starfinder 2e playtest scenario that I've played so far, we actually had to deal with 0G combat and one of our characters becoming untethered. And so having these small abilities that can offset the penalties of 0G and the untethered condition, that is actually something that can be quite useful in the right circumstances, so don't overlook options like this. Next up, we have Pahtra Lore, and this is our Ancestry Lore feat. It's going to give us acrobatics and performance, as well as the additional Lore General feat for Pahtra Lore. This is a style of feat we've seen plenty of times. And then our final first level Ancestry feat for the Pahtras is Predatory. Battle is a dance, and you've honed your body into an instrument as exquisite as it is deadly. When you select this feat, you gain your choice of a Claw or a Jaws unarmed attack. Both of these are going to be 1d6 attacks. The Claw unarmed attack is a 1d6 slashing attack that has the Agile and Finesse traits. The Jaw attack is a 1d6 piercing attack with the Finesse and Grapple traits. And at 5th level, if you get a critical hit with one of these attacks, you can get the Critical Specialization effect as well. There's a special note on here: you can take this feat a second time to pick up the second attack if you are so inclined. This isn't quite as extensive as the Brutal Anatomy feat that we saw for the Vesk, but it occupies a very similar place in terms of how a Pahtra player might use it. Before we move on, here's a quick glance at some of the other higher level feats for Pahtras. Again, pause the video if you want to read over these really fast. And then our final ancestry for today's video is the Shirren. The Shirren are an insectile species that split off from the destructive swarm. You may remember the swarm that I mentioned earlier, the hostile force that caused the Veskarium and the Pact Worlds to set aside their differences, at least briefly. Well, the Shirren are a group that broke off from that swarm and now pursue a path dedicated to their own freedom and ending the cycle of interstellar violence. Shirrens are a species of telepaths devoted to their own individualism, their communities, and living in harmony with others. Mechanically, the Shirren are a medium-sized ancestry that offer 10 bonus hit points and have a base speed of 25 feet. Their suggested attribute boosts are Constitution and Wisdom, with a free boost, and a suggested flaw of Charisma, and their starting languages are Common, Shirren, one regional language of your choice, and then additional languages equal to your intelligence modifier. Their starting traits are Humanoid and Shirren, and they have limited telepathy, allowing them to communicate mentally with other creatures out to a range of 30 feet. You can only communicate with creatures that share a language, and this doesn't give you any special access to their thoughts. And finally, it notes that this communication does not transmit any more information than normal speech could communicate. So one of the things I want to talk about here, this goes back to the conversation we had about androids in the previous video. The Starfinder setting really likes to hand out abilities like limited telepathy. One of the assumptions of Starfinder is that most people will have regular access to comm devices of some kind, just like I have regular access to my cell phone. Since communication is so easy in a modern society and would presumably be even easier in a futuristic society, one of the things that Paizo does in Starfinder is they pretty liberally pass around just free communication abilities. Androids have shortwave, allowing them to communicate with certain technological items, and a number of ancestries have some form of limited telepathy, allowing them to just telepathically communicate with people that they share a language with. In the Pathfinder setting, abilities like this could potentially cause a little bit of trouble, but in a futuristic setting, abilities like this really don't interfere with the flow of the game, and they add a lot of flavor to Ancestries. So you see Paizo do things like this a lot in Starfinder. They did it a lot in Starfinder First Edition, and they're doing it a lot here. I think this is something you can expect to see all over the place. Of course, as always, we have the write-up on the Shirren, some things that might be true about them, things that people tend to believe, a description of their society, naming convention, beliefs, edicts, anathemas. But let's go ahead and dive into the Shirren Heritages. They have 5 different heritages available, so let's take a look at what options are available to this insectile ancestry. First up, we have the Courtier Shirren. Your telepathy is stronger than most Shirren, allowing you to combine physical, verbal, and telepathic communication to better articulate your messages. You can transmit emotions alongside your messages whenever you use limited telepathy. In addition, when a creature communicates with you using limited telepathy or telepathy, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to perception checks to sense motive against that creature. This heritage feels very roleplay oriented to me. I feel like certain tables, this heritage is never going to come up, and other tables, this heritage is going to be ridiculously broken. And I think whether or not you are interested in the Courtier Shirren is going to depend on your group's playstyle, but in the right group, this could be pretty powerful. Next up, we have the Defiant Shirren. Despite the passage of time, you remain resolute in your defiance of the Swarm and other insectile tyrants. The Shirren broke off from the Swarm, and you are definitely in the group that is happy not to be a part of the Swarm anymore. If you roll a success on a will saving throw against an effect that was created by a creature with the Kucharn trait, or a creature that you know is allied with the Swarm, you get a critical success instead. Additionally, you gain the Rebellious Defiance action. Rebellious Defiance is a single action activity with the mental trait, frequency once per day, effect, you decry one foe within 100 feet that you can see as a tyrant or villain and prepare yourself to defy them even unto death. You gain a +1 circumstance bonus on your attack rolls against this foe, and you gain a +1 circumstance bonus on saving throws against the attacks, spells, and effects of this foe. These benefits last for 1 minute. So essentially once per day you can call out a particular opponent and give yourself some pretty helpful bonuses in trying to overcome them. Again, this is a heritage where I feel like the utility is going to depend at least partially on the particular table you're at. If you are in a campaign that features the Swarm heavily, the Defiant Shirren is an amazing choice. The Rebellious Defiance action makes this heritage a little more generally useful than Courtier is, but still, this very much feels like a heritage where you kind of want to know what you're getting into with the campaign before you pick this heritage. Next up, we have the Infiltrator Shirren. You descend from Shirren, who were originally programmed as infiltrators for the Swarm. Your chitin is iridescent and creates patterns that fascinate and distract most other ancestries. You can feint at a range of 10 feet rather than solely within melee reach, and you gain the Shimmering Dazzle action. Shimmering Dazzle is a single action activity with the mental and visual traits, frequency once per hour. You cause your chitin to flare and shimmer in a hypnotic display of shifting color and soothing motion. Pick a creature within 30 feet. That creature must succeed with a Fortitude save against your class DC or become dazzled for 1 round. I like the Infiltrator Shirren a little bit more than the 2 previous heritages because I do feel this is a little more generally useful than the other 2 are. The other 2 just feel kind of very focused on certain types of games, but I will say I like the fact that we have 2 different examples of Shirren Heritages that give unique actions to the Shirren player. I think that is a very nice design space, and I am glad to see Paizo doing that several times here. Next up, we have the Swarm Exile Shirren. While most Shirren broke away from the Swarm long ago, you're a more recent convert. You come from a group of castaways that have more in common with the Swarm than most other Shirren. you gain a bio-cannon ranged unarmed attack. If I'm being honest, this is kind of my favorite heritage for the Shirren. You just have a bio gun. It's either in your arm or over your shoulder, but you have a bio cannon unarmed attack. It has a range increment of 20 feet. It deals 1d6 acid damage. It's in the corrosive weapon group. You have an acid gun on your body. I love StarCraft, I love the Zerg, and the Swarm Exile Shirren just speaks to my heart, so this is probably my favorite heritage for the Shirren. Is it the best choice? I'm not sure, but is it my favorite choice? Yeah, I think it is. Next up, we have the Winged Shirren Heritage, and you can probably guess what direction this one's going. Your ancestors were members of the Swarm who evolved wings. Though you don't possess a fully functional pair of wings, you can develop them over time. When leaping horizontally, you move an additional 5 feet. You don't automatically fail your checks to high jump or long jump if you don't stride first. In addition, when you perform a long jump, you can jump a distance up to 10 feet further than the result of your athletics checks, within the normal maximum for your speed. As long as you can act, you take no damage from falling, regardless of the distance you fall, and though it doesn't mention it here, the Winged Shirren is also going to have several Ancestry feat options that allow them to slowly develop flight over time. If you remember some of the changes to flying ancestries in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that happened a couple of months ago, this is kind of why. Next up, let's talk about the first level Shirren Ancestry feats, starting with the first level feat Communalism, which is a reaction with the Concentrate and Fortune traits. Once per day, when an ally within 10 feet fails a skill check requiring 3 or fewer actions, you broadcast a helpful encouragement or a pertinent piece of information to your ally's mind. Your ally re-rolls the triggering skill check and takes the better result. So, once per day, as a reaction, you can give your ally another shot at whatever skill check they're attempting. If you've ever had an ally fail to jump from one spaceship to another, and yes, that happened to me in the Starfinder 2e playtest, this ability is quite useful. Next up, we have the Distant Telepath feat, and it lists the prerequisite as limited telepathy. Now, all Shirren presently have limited telepathy, so I don't know if that's signaling that there may be some future options that can switch out telepathy for the Shirren, or if this is just a feat for any ancestry that has limited telepathy. I'm not sure which way Paizo's going, but functionally what this feat does is increase the range of your limited telepathy by 15 feet, and you can select this feat more than once, with each selection increasing the range that you can use limited telepathy. Next up, we have Free Thinker. Your independence makes it difficult for others to intrude on your mind. You gain mental resistance equal to half your level, and you gain a +1 status bonus on all saves against mental effects. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but in a psychic duel, very helpful. Next up, we have the feat Linguistic Prodigy. Years of intense study and cultural immersion have enabled you to easily learn new languages. You gain 2 additional languages of your choice, and every time you take the multilingual feat, you gain an additional language on top of the 2 that the multilingual feat normally gives you. We've seen a lot of ancestries that have this learn languages quickly style of feat, so this is something that we've seen in other places before, but it is a choice that I find interesting. Next up, we have the Psychic Talent feat. Your psychic abilities have developed beyond simple communication. Choose 1 cantrip from the occult spell list. You can cast this cantrip as an occult innate spell at will, and the cantrip auto-heightens like would be normal for any other cantrip. Next up, we have our Ancestry Lore feat of Shirren Lore. You become trained in Diplomacy and Society, and you gain the additional lore feat for Shirren Lore. Finally, we have Unconventional Weaponry. You've familiarized yourself with a particular weapon, potentially from another ancestry or culture. Choose an uncommon, simple, or martial weapon with a trait corresponding to an ancestry, such as Vesk, or that is common in another culture. You gain access to that weapon, and for the purpose of determining your proficiency, you treat it as a simple weapon. If you are trained in all martial weapons, you can instead choose an uncommon advanced weapon. You gain access to that weapon and have familiarity with that weapon, and for purposes of proficiency, you would treat it as a martial weapon instead. Now, I believe that this feat, Unconventional Weaponry, is basically identical to the human feat that does this. There may be some slight wording differences, but it's pretty much the same thing. And I do enjoy the fact that both Shirren and humans in the Starfinder setting both have this go out and try new things, experience new things, and adapt to other cultures mentality. So even though unconventional weaponry was kind of a human thing in Pathfinder, I think it is very appropriate that they've brought it over for the Shirren here. It fits with the theme of the Ancestry really well. And while I feel like this feat is kind of niche and doesn't see a lot of play, it still is a very good fit thematically, and for the right build, could be quite compelling. And here's a quick glance at some of the other Shirren feats that are available at higher levels. Feel free to pause the video and read over them really quick if you're so inclined. But with all of that, we have covered 4 more of the Ancestry options that are currently available in the Starfinder 2e playtest. So that covers the Vesk, the Skittermanders, the Pahtra, and the Shirren, meaning that we've covered 2/3 of the Ancestry options featured in the Starfinder 2e playtest. Here in a couple of weeks, I'll be bringing around part 3 of this series, which will cover the Barathu, the Kasathas, the Lashunta, and finally the new Prismeni Versatile Heritage. So with that video, we will be wrapping this series up, but still, the time has come to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Ancestries that were featured in today's video, and do you like the design approach that Paizo has taken to each of these Ancestries? What things stand out? What do you really like? And what suggestions would you give Paizo if they were going to try to improve one of these Ancestries? Jump down to the comments section and let me know your thoughts. I genuinely enjoy the opportunity to interact with you and learn from you, so I look forward to seeing what you have to say. Don't forget to do all of that other stuff that helps support the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check out my free Discord, my Patreon, all that stuff will be in the video description. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.